Hello there! How to program an ATM machine in Java. Here we are going to complete the ATM machine we started in the first video. In the previous video, we have seen how to create the window and the user interface for our ATM machine program. We did this using Java, JavaFX, and the JavaFX feature called fxml, which, as we have seen before, it allows us to define an interface using XML. If you haven't watched the previous video, I strongly recommend that you do, so you can follow along easily. In the previous video, we created the interface, however, it didn't do anything, because we didn't add any handlers or listeners to the buttons. So that's what we're gonna do in this video. Add the code that will go behind every button to get a fully working ATM machine. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in. Let's start with an overview of how the ATM machine is going to work. The ATM will start by requesting the user to enter an account. Then, our ATM program will check if the account is valid. And valid in this case means it exists in our system. So in our case, we're gonna have two accounts. We will have an account with ID 111 and £1,000 as balance, and then another account with ID 2222 and the balance will be 2000. So if the account ID entered by the user is invalid, then we will display an error. And if the account is valid, we will move on to the menu, which is gonna have two options just to keep things simple and short for this tutorial. The first option is gonna be number 1, which will be display the balance, and then option number 2 will be withdrawal. And at this point, the user will press one of the two options. In case the user enters something different, then the option selected is not valid, so we will display an error. And in case the option is valid, we have two different paths to follow. If the user selected display balance, then the ATM machine will display the balance and then ask the user if they want to go back to the menu. And if the user selected to withdrawal, then the ATM machine will ask the amount that they want to take and then ask if they want to go back to the menu. And at this point, when the user presses OK, then we will go back to the top of the diagram. Okay, perfect. So now we have a good understanding of what the application should do. So let's follow this diagram to gradually implement the ATM application. So the first step is that the ATM will request the user to enter the account ID. So this means the ATM will display a message, then the user will press some numbers, and then they will press OK. Alright, so let's start by adding a controller to the interface. So the controller will contain the code that will be run when any component in the interface is clicked. So I will add a new class called AppController, and then I will go to our fxml file and link the controller. So that means I will go to the root node, which is right here, and add the attribute fxcontroller and then the class we just created, including the package. Perfect. Now we said we want to display a message at the start to request the user to enter an account ID. To do that, I will go to the class AppController and add the initialize method. And this will get executed right after the interface is loaded. So in the initialize method, I'm gonna call the method display welcome message. So I will create this method And what this method is gonna do is adding a message to the display test area. So I'm gonna need a reference to that component. So I will do add fxml, then private test area, and then display test area. And remember that this should be the ID that is defined in the fxml file. And now let's go back to the display welcome message method, and I will do display test area, then set test, and then the message to display, which is gonna be welcome, please enter your account ID. So let's run this now. And awesome, let's continue. So now the user will enter the account ID. This means we need to save every number that is pressed up until the user press OK. So that means I need to add a listener for every number button. So let's create another field which is gonna be of the type event handler, and then action event, and this listener is gonna be called keyboard listener, and this will implement the interface handle. And inside here I'm gonna just print a message saying number press. And now I'm gonna link the number button and the listener. So first I will get a reference to the component. So let's start with the button number 0. So I will say add fxml and then private button and 0 button. So that will be the reference. And now in the initialize method I will say 0 button set on action, and then pass the listener, so keyboard listener. And this means every time the user clicks the 0 button, the code here will get executed. So let's run this, and as you can see, if I press 0, then I can see the message number press. Perfect, so now I will do exactly the same for all the other buttons from 1 to 9. Okay, so now that all the number buttons have a listener, let's see what this listener should do. We need to get the button that was pressed so we can work out the number and then append it to a variable where we will put together the account ID. Okay, so let's do that. So I will say action event dot get source, and this will return a button. And then I will get the number, so I will say source component, then get test, and this will return a string with a number that was pressed. And now I'm gonna add a class field where I will aggregate the numbers pressed, so I will say private string and then numbers enter, which will be empty at the start. And now let's go back to the listener, and I will say numbers enter equal to numbers enter plus number. So this will put all the numbers together in one place. And then I will also give some feedback to the user, so I'm going to append the number in the display. So I will say display test area and then append test and the number. So once the user enters the account ID, then they will press OK. So let's add a listener for the OK button. So I will add a method that I'm gonna call OK button listener, and I will link this method to the button itself. So I will go to the fxml file, and the OK button is right here. So I will add the attribute on mouse click and then equal to OK button listener, which is the method that we just created. So now when someone presses OK, whatever code is inside this listener, that's what will get executed. Perfect. So what do we do here? So we will get the account ID, then we will check if it's valid, and if so, we will display the menu, and otherwise we will display an error message. Perfect. So we actually already have a variable with the number center, where we are adding all the numbers. So I'm gonna convert this to an integer. So I will say integer.parseInt and then numbers enter, and this will give us the account ID. So I'm gonna save this in a variable which is gonna be an integer, and I'm gonna call it account ID. And the next step is to check if the account ID is valid. To do this, we are gonna need to create a new class which is gonna be called ATM. And this class is gonna contain a collection of the accounts in this system. Okay, so let's create the ATM class, and this class is gonna have a field which is gonna be called accounts. So I'm gonna say private, and then the type is gonna be map, and it's gonna have integer as a key and then accounts as values. The integer is gonna be the account ID. So you might be wondering, why am I using a map? The key reason is that the research by account ID will be much faster. And in this case, because we are only searching for accounts by the account ID, then it makes sense to use a map and use the account ID as the key. Okay, so we have another class here that we haven't created yet, and that is the class accounts. So let's create it. And then this class is going to have two pieces of information. It's going to have the account ID, which is going to be an integer, and then the balance, which is going to be a float, so it allows decimal numbers. Then I will add a constructor for this class and also getters for the two fields. We may add other methods later, but let's leave it like this for now. So now we can go back to the ATM class, and in the constructor for this class, we are gonna first initialize the map. So I will say accounts is equal to new has map. And now I'm gonna create an account, which is gonna be account 1 with ID 1111 and then balance 1000. And then I will add this account to the map. So I will say accounts.put and then the account ID as a key and the account as the value. So that means that our ATM is gonna have one account now. So let's add another one. We're gonna add another account with ID 2222 and then balance 2000. Perfect. So now how do we check if a given account ID is valid? So I'm gonna create a new method. So I will say public boolean and then is account valid, and I will pass the account ID as the parameter. So what do I need to do here? First I will check if the account is in the map, and if it is, I will return true because the account exists in the system, and otherwise I will return false. So I will say account.get and then account ID, and then save this in the variable, and then if the account is equal to null, that means the account doesn't exist in the system. So then we can return false, and that means the account is not valid. Otherwise we will return true. Perfect. So now that we are able to say if the account is valid or not, let's go back to the OK button listener. So if we want to use the method we just created, we will need an instance of the class ATM. So let's add that as a field So I will say private final ATM is the class, and then the variable is going to be ATM equal to new ATM. So we have our instance now of the class ATM. So I'm gonna go back to the OK button listener. And here I will say ATM dot is account valid and pass the account ID. If the account ID is valid, we want to do two things. We want to save the account ID so we can use it later to retrieve the balance, for instance. And we also want to display the menu. So let's do that. I will add another field called selected account ID, which is going to be an integer and it's going to be private as well. And then in the listener, I will save the account ID in the new field. This way we will keep the account ID after the listener finishes. And the next thing I will do is display the menu. So to display the menu, I will create another method, and this method will first clear the display and then append the menu with the options 1 for balance and then 2 for withdrawal. So let's run this and test it. So let's enter valid account. So 1111, and then I can see the menu. So perfect, let's continue. So in case the account is not valid, we are gonna display something like account invalid, for instance. So I'm gonna create a new method which I'm gonna call display error invalid account, which is gonna be very similar to the previous one. So first I will clear the display, and then I will append a message that is gonna say account error, account invalid, please try again. And after this we will empty the variable numbers enter. And this is so the user can enter a new account ID or something else like an option. So let's test it again. So I will run it and I will enter the account ID, which is gonna be 1234. Then I will press OK, and because the account doesn't exist in our system, it will return an error message. Perfect. Next step is gonna be displaying the balance. That means after the user enters the account ID, a valid one, then the user will press OK, then the menu will display, and then the user will press 1, which means display balance. And a message with the balance will pop up in the display. So let's see how to do that. I'm gonna go back to our keyboard listener, and here is the code that will be executed every time we press a number button. So when we get here, how do we know if 1 was pressed because it's a number of the account ID or is the option that the user selected? So to check, I will say number equal 1, and if the selected account is not 0, because that means that the user already entered the account ID, so we are in the next phase. So I will assign this to a boolean called was show balance option selected, and I will say if the show balance option was selected, then what I want to do here is display the balance. For that, we will go to the ATM class and create another method that is going to be called show balance, and the parameter is going to be the account ID. This method is going to be very similar to the previous one, so I will get the account from the map, and then if the account exists, I will return the balance. If the account doesn't exist, then I will return -1. Okay, so now let's go back to the controller, and I will say atm.showBalance and pass the selected account ID, and then save this in a variable. And now all we need to do is display the balance. So I will say display task area dot clear, and then add a message with the balance. And after that we need to empty the number enter field. Alright, so let's run this again. And I will enter the account ID, which is gonna be 1111. Then I will press 1 to show the balance. And there it is, the message with the balance, which in this case is £1,000. Amazing work! I'm gonna end this tutorial here. However, I'm gonna leave a link in the description from where you can get all the code, including the code to make the withdrawal option work as well. Please, if you have questions or if you have issues, drop a comment below and I will be happy to help. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you in the next one.